I'm John Malone, a professor at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. I want to tell you how radical behaviorism is prevailing all around us, though few in the Association for Behavior Analysis or the Experimental Analysis of Behavior appear to know it. Radical behaviorism is the only proper psychology, and its tenets are evident in modern legal theory, in advertising, in some social psychology, and even in cognitive psychology. This is not to say that practitioners in these areas know that they're radical behaviorists. Most would probably deny it. Radical behaviorism will be the psychology of the 21st century. But we must know some history if we're to understand why this will be. The philosopher was right when he said, progress, far from consisting in change, depends on retentiveness. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to fulfill it. That was George Santayana, who wrote that we need not repeat the mistakes of the past. But if we can't remember the past, or if we're wholly ignorant of it, we're bound to repeat the mistakes of our predecessors. 20th century psychology is almost wholly a series of more or less awful mistakes. And it's almost entirely mediational. Its explanations refer to inferred entities. These include the mind, cognitions, habits, SR connections, sensations, and many, many, many more. Radical behaviorism excludes mediators and is constantly under attack for that reason. We're excluding the mind. Oh my goodness, how terrible. But radical behaviorism may be gaining ground in the form of adherence it knows nothing about. It's more prevalent than you might think. And for example, if we consider who might have authored these statements, mind is used as explanation when we are ignorant of causes. 2, as we become more sophisticated, we refer less to mental states. 3, we progress when we replace mentalist explanations with behavioral ones. 4, thoughts are often irrelevant to actions. 5, there's nothing mental about free will. 6, premeditation does not require mental activity. Responsibility is a social phenomenon. Mentalist views are dangerous. And others can often understand and predict our actions better than we can. Now, those sound like they come from B.F. Skinner, Howard Rachlin, me, or some other radical behaviorist, but those are statements of Richard A. Posner, a judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit and a senior lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School. Recently, he's been handling the Microsoft case. His 1990 book, The Problems of Jurisprudence, shows that radical behavioral views are more widespread than most of us realize, extending even to reinterpretations of law and the administration of justice. Posner doesn't cite Skinner. Of course, Skinner never cited anybody himself, nor does he refer to behavior analysis. But the tenets of radical behaviorism are evident in his writings. I'll describe other instances of the radical behavioral view in areas outside the experimental analysis of behavior that should give encouragement. First, let's consider current psychology. Psychology at the turn of the 21st century is nothing to be proud of. Contemporary psychology is a shambles, a junkyard, and by no means a pinnacle of achievement, as a glance at our journals and textbooks quickly tells us. An overview based on the consensus of popular textbook presentations would run pretty much as follows. First, psychology is the study of mind and behavior, which are two different things. This is an ancient and savage doctrine. Second, the mind is almost synonymous with the brain. The mind is composed of faculties or powers such as attention, memory, and reason. And these faculties are localized in specific brain centers or distributed in neural networks. This belief is nonsense. The senses, such as vision, are directly analogous to input channels. Sensory information enters and is processed. Seeing and hearing are somehow brought about by nerve cells in the brain. But we haven't found any magic neurons yet. They conduct or don't conduct. They carry a graded charge. The mind or brain is profitably viewed as a wonderful computer, whether digital or analog. This all reminds us of the line by comedian Emo Phillips, who said, "I used to think that the brain was the greatest organ in the human body. Then I realized, hey, look what's telling me that." It's almost impossible to entertain the possibility that this is the best conception of psychology thus far attained. In fact, it's not greatly different from Plato's psychology. And whenever you think of Plato as a philosopher, no one can admire his psychology, based as it is on the dualism of mind and body, as well as the dualism of subject and object. And what of the public perception of psychology? Consider the following bill, which was passed by the New Mexico State Senate in March of 1995, and goes, when a psychiatrist or psychologist testifies during a defendant's competency hearing, the psychologist or psychiatrist shall wear a cone-shaped hat that's not less than 2 feet tall. The surface of the hat shall be imprinted with stars and lightning bolts. Additionally, the psychologist or psychiatrist shall be required to don a white beard that's not less than 18 inches in length, and shall punctuate crucial elements of his testimony by stabbing the air with a wand. Whenever a psychologist or psychiatrist provides expert testimony regarding the defendant's competency, the bailiff shall dim the courtroom lights and administer 2 strokes to a Chinese gong. Now, unfortunately, the New Mexico State House didn't pass that, but it would have been well if they had. Conventional psychology is an embarrassment. What exactly is radical behaviorism? And what's the evidence that it should be preserved? I believe it's a set of tenets, some of which have been around for a long, long time, and I believe there's ample evidence that it should be preserved and promoted. And to review its tenets, they are as follows. Number 1, radical behaviorism involves no dualisms, whether of mind, body, or subject and object. Radical behaviorism deals with dynamics, not statics, processes, activity, thinking, not things like sensations and ideas. Radical behaviorism accepts no mediators, such as memories, images, expectancies, sensations, percepts, cognitions, and so on, although we certainly do have private experience. But private experience is included, but treated as activity. It doesn't occur inside us or outside us. It's just activity that may not be visible to others. Number 5, much that we call mental phenomena is actually behavior occurring over time. As Howard Rachlin has followed Aristotle in making a convincing case for the equivalence of mental and observable activity extended in time, and I'll return to this shortly. Traditional operant conditioning terms have no special status. Stimulus, response, reinforcement, terms used by Skinner in 1938 are not necessarily sacred nor timeless. Now, radical behaviorism has already been successful in proposing Molar solutions to vexing problems. Modern behaviorism is radical behaviorism, and it is Molar. That is, it considers patterns of events occurring over time. I warn you, some people will never, ever understand this, although people of great intelligence just can't seem to get it. Patterns of events occurring over time. This is opposed to the rest of psychology, which relies on old-time, O-L-D-E-T-Y-M-E, old-time experimental design, immediate causes, and discrete events. Psychology is full of stimuli, sensations, cognitions, feelings, attitudes, disordered personalities, and many other immediate causes. In short, psychology is full of something, and that is mediators, although there's a 4-letter word that could work too. It's as if John Locke never died, and his conviction that our experience requires the mediation of ideas never faded. We even think that we see images. But this approach is stalled in the face of insoluble problems. Happily, radical behaviorism and the Molar approach can rescue us from this hopeless morass. Consider familiar examples of effects of the radical behavioral revolution. First, the law of effect. For 30 years, God, more than 30 years, but 30 years, the law of effect has been a Molar law. It no longer refers to the barfy 3-term contingency of textbook presentations of stimulus, response, and consequence. barfy three-term contingency. Rather than referring to momentary contingencies and contiguous causes, current individual stimuli responses and reinforcers, the law has become a Molar law of effect. Thus, we find that relative behavior over time matches relative reinforcement over time. Behavior may be measured in rate of response, time allocation, or other ways, and reinforcement may refer to rate or magnitude or some other aspect. This represents a major advance and has found application in the applied analysis of behavior. Second, avoidance learning. Much psychotherapy that works is based on the notion that patients are avoiding fear-producing objects. Many textbooks have chronicled the painful history of research in avoidance conditioning, an area which clearly shows the failure of mediational theories based on fear and shows the molecular approach and shows the failure of the molecular approach in general. In 1966, Herrnstein and Heinlein showed that a Molar variable, overall shock frequency reduction, establishes avoidance responding very quickly, even when each avoidance response produces immediate shock. Responding is maintained as long as the overall frequency of shock is reduced. Again, this shows that behavior over time is sensitive to consequences over time, and that recourse to individual responses tells us nothing. Third, conditioned reinforcement, which is itself a nonsense term. In the early 18th century, John Gay was a Scottish clergyman who wondered how money, fame, and other things gain their power. He noticed that one might initially seek money because of the things that it buys, but later money seems to have value in itself, even exceeding the values of the goods that it buys. Gay wrote that some people even, quote, sell their happiness for money, thus anticipating the notion of functional autonomy of motives described by Allport 2 centuries later. Reviewers puzzled for decades over the fact that powerful and durable conditioned reinforcement is almost impossible to demonstrate in the laboratory, in spite of the myriad number of acquired reinforcers that daily surround us: money, praise, attention, and more. How do they gain their power? Except through pairing with already effective reinforcers. But if their power comes from pairing, how can their power exceed that of the events on which they're supposedly based, so that people sell their happiness for money? The old mediational theories had no answer. The answer was found in the work of Nuringer and Chung, Harvard, of course, who showed that tones, flashes, and other innocuous stimuli could gain strong reinforcing power when delivered according to the same contingencies that deliver already potent reinforcers. If a fixed ratio 11 schedule produces food 15% of the time and a brief flash 85% of the time, the flash will act as a reinforcer, increasing response rate dramatically over that occurring with food alone. So conditioned reinforcers are actually acquired reinforcers. It's a Molar effect such that patterns of behavior over time become sensitive to contingencies in effect. Acquired reinforcers gain their power because they're produced according to the same rule that produces already effective reinforcers. The fourth area, which is mysterious to many, even though when it's described to them, is the area of schedules of reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement and patterns of responding that they generate constitute powerful evidence for a Molar behavioral approach. Despite countless attempts to analyze their effects in terms of molecular units and contiguous causes, the patterns of responding on simple schedules remain inexplicable. Gradients of reinforcement, chaining, conditioned reinforcement cannot account for the fixed interval scallop. But there's more. In a classic presentation, Morse and Kelleher showed that the effects of drugs and of things usually thought of as reinforcers and punishers may be determined by the schedule according to which they're administered. In a variety of ways, behaviors were established either because they produced food or avoided shock. After long training, conditions were changed so that responses produced only strong shock, which would be avoided under other circumstances. Responding continued and assumed the pattern of the schedule in effect. This showed that the contingencies themselves could alter the functional relationships among behaviors and consequences. Shock maintained responding, just as would food. Nothing is inherently reinforcing or punishing under all conditions, as the Premack principle illustrated years ago. This is probably the strongest evidence for the Molar approach to behavior analysis, and has been questioned by critics who can't stand to view painful shock as a positive reinforcer. Thus, since the effect appears only on interval schedules, it's been proposed by someone at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research that it's the punishment of long interresponse times by shock that produces an illusory reinforcing effect by increasing the proportion of short interresponse times and thus increasing response rate. Blah. This can't account for the fact that responding appears in the patterns appropriate to the schedule, usually fixed interval, or that responding occurs at all. It's a basic effect. Electric shock itself, avoided under some circumstances, can act as a reinforcer. Now, let's consider reconceptualizations that are congruent with radical behaviorism, beginning with one from the inside, from Howard Rachlin, concerning our conception of pain, which is an interesting area. In 1985, Howard Rachlin proposed, amazingly and shockingly, that pain is not a private event. Now, this raises eyebrows, usually, as had been assumed by millennia, for millennia. Instead, he argued that pain is an overt behavior with nothing whatever subjective about it. Bear in mind that Rachlin sees nothing private in seeing a bird, either. This appears in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, 1985, Volume 8, pages 43-83. Rachlin carried the argument much further, claiming that pain, like love, virtue, and other mental categories, is an instance of temporally extended patterns of overt observable behavior. Being in pain is just showing pain behavior, often and in many circumstances. Though pain seems to be a private sensation, it is all observable behavior. It is impossible to feel pain and not to show it, because to feel pain is to show it. Even when I'm alone, my pain is observable if someone is there to observe it. If no one else is present, I observe that I am wincing, moaning, taking analgesics, and the like. And so I judge that I'm in pain. Preposterous as this seems, pain is an odd phenomenon when we consider it closely. Thank goodness for the fact that radical behavioral views are becoming influential outside the experimental analysis of behavior and applied behavior analysis. As I've said before, all truly reasonable people, given enough education and experience, eventually become radical behaviorists, though they may never have heard those words. Thus, we find exemplars in areas outside behavior analysis. I'll briefly describe examples in law, social psychology, and cognitive science that seem unknown to most behavior analysts. First, radical behaviorism and law. And this is back to Richard Posner, distinguished jurist and a judge who's thought much about human thoughts and motives. He understands radical behaviorism very well and advocates a behavioral approach to the dispensation of justice. Tied with this is his advocacy of pragmatism, illustrated in his discussion of belief and the causes of action. As Charles Peirce argued over a century earlier, action is the key to belief and to meaning. Belief without action is nothing. A statement has meaning, we believe it, and therefore are prepared to act on it. Without belief and action, words are only words. Posner suggested that even the idea of mind has no consequences and may therefore be best dispensed with. He proposed it in a way that could have been written by B.F. Skinner. He wrote, "Obviously, most adults and older children can and do speak without vocalization. That is, can conceal their thoughts and form mental images. But this bare-bones conception of mind, which essentially equates mind to consciousness, is different from the idea that there's something, the mind, which is the locus of intentions, the invisible puppeteer, the inner man or woman Precisely Skinner's words from 1953. It is that idea which may have no consequence for law and should perhaps be discarded, despite the law's emphatic commitment to it. I suggest that we often use the word mind, either in the weak sense of consciousness or in the strong sense of intentionality and control, not to name a thing, but to cover our ignorance of certain causal relationships. That's a radical behavioral interpretation. That was Skinner's opening statement in 1953, though Posner cited none of Skinner's works. Perhaps Hume and Wittgenstein, who he did cite, were enough. And perhaps he's unaware of Skinner's arguments. Posner went on, though, with a Skinnerian analysis. As Posner wrote, one could argue that as law becomes more sophisticated, states of mind should play an ever larger role in liability. Our understanding of the mind may improve. Maybe we'll learn to read minds. But maybe there's nothing to read. Or maybe we're not interested in what the murderer was thinking when he pulled the trigger. If we take seriously the actor's adage that no man is a villain in his own eyes, we can expect to find, if we ever succeed in peering into the murderer's mind, an elaborate, perhaps quite plausible, rationalization for his deed. But so what? We would punish him all the same. Finally, though we never cite Skinner or Howard Rachlin, Judge Posner proposes that we not only lack real liberty, but that others may understand our actions better than we do. This section is titled Behaviorism and the Judicial Perspective, and begins with Posner's noting that behaviorism, which relies on external rather than internal causes, seems antithetical to the self-conscious activity of a judge. But there's no inconsistency. He explains, since we commonly predict correctly what another will do without any knowledge of that person's conscious experience, in fact, we can often predict accurately even when the person himself is undecided. Can others predict your behavior better than you can do yourself? When the parent or probation officer or psychologist predicts the behavior of another better than does the child, parolee, or patient themselves, it's not because the predictor knows the contents of the individual's mind. That's irrelevant, says Posner. But the expert or parent has information that the individual lacks, either because of lack of training or experience, or because of emotional involvement. That's a behavioral viewpoint. Perhaps more important, people routinely misrepresent their motives to themselves, pretending to be less concerned with status, money, and other base things than is actually the case. And we think of ourselves as braver, less selfish, and more ethical than we actually are, according to Posner. This is 1990, The Problems of Jurisprudence. Now, a second area in which we have behavioral applications, perhaps less clear and surprising, is in advertising. This is not the application of advertising by John B. Watson at J. Walter Thompson Advertising Company and yada, yada. This is Robert Hopkins, who communicated with me a year ago from the Allstate Research and Marketing Center in Menlo Park, California, Allstate Insurance Company. And Hopkins complains about the cognitive revolution affecting marketing and factory research. We think that the cognitive revolution affected only psychology, but in fact, the dumbing down was much more general. As Hopkins writes, because of World War II, a similar contrast arose in business in two important areas, factory training and marketing research. Subsequently, companies switched back from efficient use of behavior science to a kind of feeble pre-war cognitivism. The switch was so complete that now people younger than 50 know virtually nothing of the behaviorist era in business and its economic advantages. Hopkins writes that in the corporations, the change to cognitivism pushed marketing and training costs way up for a given increment of productivity. In the universities, business education turned toward fantasy and away from objectivity. These historical turns were not seen as flights of fancy, but as triumphs of liberty. The common theme of these three takes on semantics is the fallibility of verbal and other symbolic discourse about facts, the adoption of questionnaires and verbal methods. The enormous efficiencies of behavioral methods had no carryover in American practices after World War II, although they were successfully exported to Japan by MacArthur, who took seriously the need to help that beaten country to economic self-sufficiency. When the war ended, trainers in the U.S. dropped the process of designing discovery experiences and administering rewards. The old practices, mainly verbal lectures, were revived. Trainers here didn't, after all that experience, come away with better insight into efficiency than their pre-war intuitions. For psychology as a science of both behavior and mind, the late 1950s broke the 20th century into two periods. This is still Robert Hopkins. The first was marked by major behaviorist breakthroughs, and the second by cognitivist reaction and retreat from the benefits of those breakthroughs. Effectively, agencies turned to what proved to be easier and more profitable, searching for ideas to sell their client executives. The advertising agencies saw they didn't need good consumer data for the latter purpose, just those client service skills that include schmoozing, sales hype, and team player optimism. Sounds like a motivational workshop. We now primly call much of this networking. It's very verbal. If effective behavioral methods dominated in marketing, many advertising agencies and media firms would close. Telephone and mail survey organizations, too. The work of writing questionnaires and interpreting answers would largely disappear. Many of the veterans of marketing and consumer research wouldn't be able to adjust, because their aptitudes for talk and autocratic dispositions would not be right for conducting such tests with physical response methods. And there are such methods. According to Hopkins, who published a paper titled Consumer Act Good Responses in Pre-Tests and Subsequent Sales in 1987 in Current Issues and Research in Advertising, University of Michigan, volume 10, pages 1 through 38. Hopkins claims that consumer pretest methods have been developed that appear to achieve accurate sales forecasts. Evidence so far is limited to small bodies of data, but behaviorist theory appears to account for the accuracy. Conventional research methods, relying on verbal interrogation of consumers, questionnaires, about preferences and buying intentions, have not provided accurate sales forecasts. Recent years have produced several unconventional alternatives that offer evidence of high accuracy of 95% or better, as opposed to 50% or worse with questionnaires. Yet for several reasons, loyalty to the conventional methods has been persistent. There's been at least one historical occasion when the inadequacy of today's standard consumer research was appropriately assessed and the research abandoned. McNeil in 1974 recounted the history of the U.S. government's termination of a program of measuring consumer purchase expectations because the verbal data were not sales-related enough to be useful in policy decisions. Details of the methods and results were reported by Juster in 1966. Regardless of the wording or combination of questions, only half of the consumers who said they were certain to buy did so. As much or more of the sales volume later proved to be accounted for by consumers who said they did not intend to purchase the products, which were autos and major appliances. The bottom line is that questionnaires are silly pests. As Bogart in 1986 wrote, in the immortal words of the TV newscaster announcing the results of a call-in poll, "We know these figures are wrong, but we thought you'd like to have them anyway." How many times have we heard that? Now, what's wrong with questionnaires? Well, excuse me, we have to consider the nature of self-reports that are used in answering questionnaires. And our best information in that regard comes from Daryl Bem, back then at Stanford University, and his theory of self-perception. In a brilliant analysis of the nature of self-reports, Daryl Bem introduced the theory of self-perception in 1967. Bem is a social psychologist, but one familiar with radical behaviorism, who offered a compelling behavioral alternative to the cognitive mediational theory of cognitive dissonance, which was wildly popular at the time. It still is in some circles. According to cognitive dissonance theory, dissonant cognitions having to do with our behavior, physiological states, and other beliefs may conflict, giving rise to an aversive drive similar to hunger. We then reduce this dissonance in various ways, often by changing our cognitions so they don't conflict. Rationalization is a word for the same process. For example, subjects induced to engage in counter-attitudinal behavior, such as giving a pro-Fidel Castro speech, often show a change in attitude toward the disliked topic. In this case, Castro would be rated as less disliked, reducing the dissonance produced by giving the pro-Castro speech. I dislike Castro. I just gave a pro-Castro speech. I don't notice that I was coerced to do it. Hence, when you ask me again weeks or months later, I will say that I like Castro more than I said in the past. And I will also say that I said that back then. This is a prime example of mediational theory, with imagined internal conflicts among imagined cognitions. Bem proposed that we examine the nature of self-reports and reach a better understanding of so-called attitude changes. Following Skinner's analysis, Bem argued that we learn to judge the attitudes of others through observations of their behavior. So we judge someone's hunger by how much we see him eat. Often we apply the same practice to ourselves, as when we conclude that I was not as hungry as I thought. In the majority of cognitive dissonance studies, subjects are asked questions for which they had no ready answer, and so assess their attitude by considering their own behavior. I might give you a negative assessment of Castro if you ask me for one, and I really have no firm opinion. But if you ask me again, after I've given a pro-Castro speech, under coercion that I didn't notice, I have more information to go on. Had I known that someone else had given the speech, I would judge his opinion of Castro to be that much more favorable. In judging myself, I sometimes do the same thing. Now, you ask me what I think of my mother, and I got a firmer opinion. You're not going to change it. But ask me what I think of Poland or the Pope or Fidel Castro or the taste of fried grasshoppers, and I really don't have an opinion, so I look at what I do and assess my own opinion. Bem emphasized that this was an account based on radical behaviorism, bless his little heart, but no one seemed to notice. Skinner learned of it at some time or other. He wrote a note on it that appeared in his published notebooks. He knew that Bem saw self-perception as a radical behavioral treatment, but for reasons I'll never understand, Skinner wrote that he didn't see the connection. Go figure. Along the same lines, in 1977, Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson published a telling piece titled Telling More Than We Can Know, which is also a behavioral rendition or treatment that occurred in social psychology. Nisbett and Wilson surveyed data going back to the 1930s, in which subjects gave verbal reports to account for actions. This included studies of aesthetic evaluations, phobic reactions, placebo effects, problem solving, paired associate learning, and dozens of dissonance and attribution studies. They found the majority of cases, verbal reports were irrelevant, and that the behavioral effects were in most cases stronger, this is a quote, than the verbal report effects. In cases where a verbal report about motive state and behavioral reports about motive state were reported, the correlation was found to be nil. In studies where data are available, they wrote, no association is found between degree of verbal report change and degree of behavior change. People have no power to examine their thoughts and accurately explain their actions. People's report about their higher mental processes should be neither more or less accurate in general than predictions about such processes made by observers. They found that people have virtually no knowledge of their mental processes, though they commonly believe that they do. It's a pity that Skinner didn't recognize kindred doctrine in this latest form of attribution theory, which shows that verbal reports are just verbal behavior, and that's just more behavior. It doesn't reveal anything. Even cognitive science and research on the unconscious is really behavioral, at least in some cases. If we go back to Hermann Ebbinghaus, 1885, über das Gedächtnis, Ebbinghaus's savings method, the study of memory, was an early assessment of implicit memory, or unconscious memory, a topic that became a focus of interest in the late 20th century. Ebbinghaus insightfully realized that in a case where he, being the subject, or someone else, reports no memory of something, you can still reveal that there's something there because that material can be relearned faster. It's an ingenious method, simple though it is. Earlier, during the 1960s, controversy over learning without awareness and subliminal perception had raged, with the crude experiments presented by both sides, and the controversy settled nothing and lent an aura of chicanery and foolishness to the field. During the 1980s and 90s, the methods had become refined, and the controversy was less coarsely conducted. By 1997, a major conference was even devoted to the topic of perceiving, learning, and remembering without conscious awareness. This occurred at Carnegie Mellon University. A topic that was of great interest to William James and to others of his time was again interesting to researchers. While some railed against what they viewed as behaviorism, people who didn't understand it, the methods and interpretations were frequently behavioral, in the best sense of the word. One example here will have to suffice. And this is what I call a novel use for the Stroop test, or procedure. In 1935, J.R. Stroop showed that people were slow to name colors when a printed word color, such as red, red, appeared in blue or green letters. They're quicker when the word and color matched. His interest was in the disruptive effect this had on learning. But later researchers used it for a different purpose, as a way to separate explicit and implicit reactions. Consider one example, that of Maracle and Cheeseman, who presented subjects with color word primes, red, or green, the words red or green, followed by red or green target letters, target colors. The ordinary Stroop effect occurs when subjects are quicker at naming congruent color words and colors, red followed by red color, and slower when the prime and color are incongruent, red followed by green. However, these authors also manipulated the percentage of trials when color word and color matched, so that this occurred only 25% of the time. This means that on 75% of the trials, 3/4, the color word red would be followed by the color green. Subjects quickly learn this, and so become quicker at identifying green when the priming color word is red, because 3/4 of the time the word red is followed by green. This is assumed to be an explicit, consciously adopted strategy, as opposed to the ordinary Stroop effect, which is an automatic, implicitly, unconsciously controlled reaction. Unconscious, comparatively speaking. Maracle and others also varied the duration of presentation of the priming word. In different blocks of trials, the color word primes are present for brief, median 57 milliseconds, or long, 214 milliseconds, durations. The color word was presented for one of those durations, then masked by a row of asterisks that turned either red or green at the 300 millisecond mark. Imagine you got the prime word, red or green word, 57 milliseconds or 214 milliseconds. Then you've got a color following it. And 75% of the time, the color is different from the word prime. When the prime words were present for the brief duration, a standard Stroop effect occurred, and the subjects reacted faster to red, red color, and to green, green color, than to green, red color, red, green color. But when the prime word was present for the longer duration, the subjects were faster responding to the incongruent color, which in fact appeared 3/4 of the time. Thus, RED, green color, was responded to quickly, presumably since subjects were explicitly, consciously adjusting their preparation. Now, this all gets to the issue of how many ways can you ask a question. Specifically, how many ways can you ask subjects to report what they saw, learned, or remembered when they initially tell you the answer is nothing? Miracle and colleagues argue that it's useful to think of thresholds as subjective versus objective. The subjective threshold is the minimum value of stimulation that the subject reports can be sensed. And the second, the objective threshold, is a lower threshold that includes stimulus values that are still effective, though unknown to the subject. This sounds close to Skinner's position, where many selves, some of which are conscious, in the sense that they can use language and describe private experience, rule-governed behavior. But others are not verbal and are shut off from the articulate introspective self that we call me. The cognitive people call that explicit versus implicit. And Miracle and Cheeseman are doing behavioral work. Given the accomplishments of radical behaviorism, do we really need to feel envious of mainstream cognitive psychology? Does a discipline that exemplifies mediation and underlying processes warrant emulation? How well is cognitive psychology and cognitive science, the creationism of psychology, done? Well, consider the chaos that is cognitive psychology. Since the 1960s, there's been great pressure to join the cognitive revolution, due to the perception that great strides are being made by those who dare to study the mind. For a time, this fostered the field of animal cognition, as if humans didn't supply enough. And there's still the odd thinking, talking chimpanzee and parrot boring us to death. In fact, cognitive psychology is a sham, a synonym for pop psychology, a field in which the adopting of a vocabulary has been treated as a revolution. It's really the same old stuff, and there's no revolution. In 1997, Clark Glymore, a worker in cognitive neuroscience at Carnegie Mellon University, offered the following observation. One January a few years ago, shortly after the governor of Arizona had been impeached, and the Exxon Valdez had spilled its cargo around Port Arthur, I had one of those uncanny experiences reserved for the people who read old news. Paging through the San Jose Mercury for January 1917, I came upon an article describing the impeachment of the governor of Arizona and a report of a large oil spill at Valdez, Alaska. Nietzsche, it seems, was onto something. The eternal return, no news under the sun, history repeats itself, sort of thing. I've had similar uncanny experiences over the last few years, reading bits of the literature of cognitive science as it has emerged in our time, and reading in the same years the literature of physiology, psychology, and psychiatry in the closing years of the 19th century. He then goes on in a 1997 volume to recount specific instances of this. Another observer, Thomas Hardy Leahy, author of History of Psychology textbooks, has argued that the history of American psychology is a plausible but dangerous myth, and that there have been no revolutions outside of Wundt's founding of psychology to begin with. The advent of behaviorism in 1913 was revolutionary only in that it broadened psychology to include animals, children, and the insane. A conclusion also reached by Hilgard. So there's no revolution, and cognitive psychology, or science, refers to no one entity, as an examination of textbooks quickly reveals. And to give only one example, White examined the studies cited in 7 popular cognitive psychology textbooks, finding of the total 3,200 references, only 19 were included in all 7 texts. only 144 were cited by even 4 of the 7 books. In 1983, found that the 3,500 references in 8 human memory textbooks included less than 1% that appeared in all the books. A whopping 80%, or 2,800 references, were cited in only 1 of the 10 books. In 1995, Best found the same thing. The citations in second editions of 5 cognitive psychology books published between 1985 and 1988 included only 19 that appeared in all texts, and 80% appeared in only a single textbook. If only 20% of the references appear in more than a single textbook, it's difficult to argue that cognitive psychology is a coherent discipline. Cognitive psychology is not a coherent discipline, and it's certainly not to be emulated. Rather, it seems to illustrate the horrors of mediationism better than any argument I could make. But what about applied behavior analysis? How closely does the applied analysis of behavior follow the tenets of radical behaviorism? Has it remained non-mediational, yet shown an appreciation for private experience as a part of our subject matter? Has the Molar perspective exerted any influence? These questions have disappointing answers, at least based on the past few years' issues of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. Since 1995, the articles chosen by the editors and placed on the World Wide Web focus on the treatment of pica, the eating of inedible objects, tics, self-injury, reading and spelling, and eating. Methods include reinforcement, punishment, effort requirements, and other simple and specific methods. One paper on habit reversal reviews the use of competing behaviors in treating habits such as tics, nail and lip biting, a method promoted by Edwin Guthrie back in the 1930s. Another investigates the membership of self-destructive behaviors in the same or different response classes. Private behavior is not mentioned, nor is assessment of patterns of behavior occurring over time. But at least mediators have not crept in. Brian Iwata, who publishes about 5 papers a day, provides a rare example of a functional analysis, and this consists of assessing pathological behaviors in different contexts, so as to infer the past contingencies that produce the behaviors. In the case of self-injurious behavior, some subjects showed a history of attention paid was operating, while for others, self-stimulation or escape from academic demands was responsible for maintaining and presumably establishing the problem behavior. Does private experience play a part in applied behavior analysis? Interestingly, the answer is difficult, since many behavior analysts are methodological behaviorists and appear to believe that we're machines with no minds and so on. Freeman, Hayes, and Wilson recently proposed that anxiety, and recently, this is 1998, that anxiety be conceptualized in terms of behavior analysis and treated as avoidance behavior. Peter Lamal criticized this proposal as a reversion to mentalism and argued that emotion is a private event and therefore outside the realm of behavior analysis. While methodological behaviorism seems alive in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, others are using verbal reports as corollaries of private behavior, including emotion, in the way that Skinner always advocated. For example, Robert Kohlenberg's psychotherapy, and there are others. But by and large, radical behaviorism appears to be as unfamiliar to behavior analysts, at least applied behavior analysts, as it is to cognitivists. Well, in summary, radical behaviorism is fundamentally different from conventional psychology. It denies the mind-body distinction and stresses activity. Second, radical behaviorism has found application in psychology, solving age-old problems through a Molar analysis. Third, radical behaviorism is also influential in areas outside psychology, such as law and advertising. Fourth, applied behavior analysts show no signs of appreciating radical behaviorism or even understanding it. That's the end of my presentation.